Excellencies, Ministers, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to get proceedings going. It gives me great pleasure to introduce the speakers for our leaders panel entitled Status and Outlook for Multilateralism. Our moderator this afternoon, Mr. Angel Gurria, Secretary General of the OECD. Mr. Maris Kuczynskis, Prime Minister of the Republic of Latvia. Mr. Didier Reynders, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs, Belgium. Mr. Bruno Le Maire, Minister for Economy and Finance of the French Republic. Mr. David Parker, Minister for Economic Development, Environment, Trade and Export Growth, New Zealand. Ms. Siv Jensen, Minister of Finance, Norway. And Mr. Wilbur Ross, Secretary of Commerce from the USA. Mr. Gurria, the floor is yours.
Dear friends, hello everyone. We have this privileged group of panelists with us today who are going to be discussing the main theme of our ministerial. And so I will go immediately to the Prime Minister of Latvia and to ask you, Prime Minister, Latvia is a small, vibrant economy, open to the world, dependent on the world. How is it affected by the changing dynamics in multilateralism? And how can Latvia contribute to make multilateralism more efficient?
Good afternoon, and I'll be speaking Latvian.
The translation. Okay. It's in the little bag to the right of your chair. Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Latvia indeed is a relatively small country with small economy. We have less than 2 million population. However, today's topic is multilateralism, and for us, multilateralism plays a great role, and we make a great use of multilateralism, at least compared to bigger countries. There's no other way for us than use the multilateralism to our advantage. And we have to be a part of different projects, of different organizations. 2 years ago, by the way, we exceeded the OECD. We are also a NATO member state, and we are a country that supports closer Europe, and we care about the future of Europe, and that's why we are heavily involved in a discussion on the future of Europe. And today I met with MEDEF, with French Business Association, and I told them that, the time when everyone competed against each other is gone. Today you can make business gains, or you can gain political victories only if you cooperate with others on win-win basis, and that's why Latvia is trying to build upon all of its advantages, like quality education, conscientious workforce, hardworking labor force and small economy, which can quickly adjust to various changes, are those advantages upon which we are building. And according to our OECD survey, we are a top reformer. They've studied our reforms and have recognized that we're a top reformer. We need to further reform science, and we need to science, research and development, and digitalization also plays a prominent role. 80%, more than 80% of our people are using various digital products.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister, and we welcome Bruno Le Maire, who is the Minister of Finance and Economy of France. And because he just arrived, and because we're gonna catch him cold. So, Monsieur Le Maire, France is the chair of this meeting. It says it's reshaping the foundations of multilateralism, refonder le multilatéralisme. Pourquoi est-ce que la France a choisi?
Why has France chosen this topic?
That you thought that focusing on multilateralism today is of the essence. Please.
Bonjour.
Good afternoon, Angel. Good afternoon, everybody. I think that if there were no issues with multilateralism today, the President of the Republic in France would not have chosen this theme, multilateralism. But we can clearly see that today multilateralism is being called into question. Certain states feel that at the end of the day there are faster, more effective solutions that are sometimes more brutal, but that take the form of unilateral decisions, and that this may replace the multilateral world order. We do not share that point of view. The President of the Republic and I, along with the other European states, continue to believe that multilateralism is the only solution for developing trade, and we are very attached to the development of free trade, which generates growth and which generates jobs. So we believe that multilateralism is the only solution for guaranteeing stability, peace, and strategic calm. Multilateralism is also the best way allowing us to think about the future. Angel, I'm thinking in this regard of taxation, for example. We see with the development of digitalization that we need to work on what good international fiscal policy looks like. We need to work collectively, for example, as you have done here in the OECD, as the OECD has done so remarkably, working on the tax base in the BEPS program, thinking about the new taxation in the digital era. So, no, multilateralism is not dead. And yes, multilateralism is necessary in dealing with the major issues facing the planet: climate change, taxation, trade, to mention just a few examples. I'm not saying that multilateralism has no flaws. Of course not. And of course, we share a certain number of concerns that have been expressed, for example, by the United States with regard to the poor functioning of certain multilateral organizations. We see that the World Trade Organization today really needs to be rethought. It is an organization that is necessary, but it needs to be profoundly reviewed. And so we are holding out our hand. The French nation is holding out its hand to all of those who are interested in recasting multilateralism. We believe that multilateralism, as I said, is necessary for trade, for thinking about taxation, to ensure stability, Yes, we must do better, and we must do so faster. But let us not abandon multilateralism, because a sum of unilateral decisions will never replace multilateral agreements. The accumulation of unilateral measures increase the risk of confrontation, which is in the interest of no one. We in France, we in Europe do not want to see trade wars. We want to see a free trade developing around the world. And if we are attacked, we need to defend our interests. I think it is very much to be preferred that we should all work together to find agreement, the way to develop trade, because what is at stake here is our prosperity, our jobs, our wealth, our stability. Thank you very much, Minister.
Norway. Your country has been an active promoter of the multilateral system. In fact, the first full term serving UN Secretary General, Trygve was a Norwegian. You've been one of the champions of multilateral action. What is missing in terms of spirit? What is missing in terms of drive in today's multilateral system? What would need to change? Perhaps if you give us a kind of a Nordic flavor for the issue.
Thank you. Let me start by saying that as a small, open economy, adjusting to changing international circumstances is sort of in our DNA. Nordic economies are known to be flexible for businesses, while at the same time provide opportunities for all citizens. I think that's the core of how we think. But of course, multilateralism has been under strain for some time. Several challenges are well known. The disruptive digital transformation, emerging economies that shift global economic power, global overcapacity in some sectors, and populations in many countries that do not experience the benefits of trade. Hence, there is an increasingly skeptical public opinion in many countries. But I mean, to meet these challenges, we need more cooperation, not less. In my view, trade creates wealth, trade creates jobs, and as a small open economy, we are dependent on export in order to import all the goods that we are not able to produce ourselves. Just give one small example. We are a huge producer of seafood. Every single day, Norway exports 23 million plates or seafood dinners only to Europe. Every single day. So, of course, this is how we have created our wealth. But the debate doesn't stop there. One thing is for a nation to create wealth. Another thing is how you to distribute that wealth evenly in your population. And I think that is the success factor, actually, for many of the Nordic countries.
Thank you very much, Minister Jensen. Let me ask Didier Reynders, Deputy Prime Minister of Belgium. Now, multilateralism is often portrayed as slow or insufficiently responsive to today's challenges. The focus of our ministerial is to make multilateralism, the title says, more responsible and effective, which means we recognize that there's something that is not quite there, and therefore we should perhaps improve it. So what are the things that you believe that we should focus on? What are the issues? What are the goals? What would you change?
Merci, Angel. La première chose que je...
Thank you, Angel. The first thing I would say is this, and I don't want to repeat what's already been said because we very much share this analysis within the European Union amongst ourselves of the need to continue multilateralism, but above all to recast it. So there are perhaps another couple of points that are specific in nature that I will come back to.
Well, for Belgium, it's very important to go further with the multilateral approach. We are founding members of many different international organizations, and certainly the WTO, but also OECD and the European Union and others. And so we try to explain that as an open economy like Norway, it's very important for us to go further with a very multilateral trading system. And just to insist on some point, it's fundamental to have a strong, fair, and rule-based trading system at the multilateral level. And it's very important to do that also for the predictability of the trade system at the international level. And I want to say that we try, of course, to continue to reform the WTO, but we try also to have the capacity and the capability to settle a dispute orderly. And to settle disputes orderly, it's just possible to do that with a real multilateral system. And of course, we have, for the moment, huge discussions about that and about the appointment of some judges in the WTO system. But we need to discuss on that and to try to go further. Of course, we have some concerns about the actual multilateral approach in the WTO, and it's important to go further with fair trading practices and to prove that we are very open to discuss on that and to try to convince some other partners to apply the same rules. But if it's possible to have an open process, it will be a necessity to organize maybe a more transparent and a more inclusive process about the trading system. And we will try to work on that. Just to say that we have, to give an example from the Belgian point of view, we have tried to put together sometimes in Geneva WTO and ILO. And it's very important to discuss about some rules in the labor market. Also, when we are discussing about trade, it's very important to discuss about human rights. It's important to discuss about climate change. So to try to address some global challenges through a multilateral approach. But again, we are open to modernize and to organize new elements in the process at the multilateral level, but it's very important to continue to work on that and to work on that, if it's possible, together with all the different partners, and if it's possible, inside the different organizations. So I'm hoping that we will have not only the discussion here, but maybe also in the WTO.
Wilbur Ross, analysts refer to the fact that President Trump was elected in the United States by the fact that he actually captured this feeling of dissatisfaction with the globalization process, that he captured the disaffection. So the question is, and we've seen a number of results of elections all over Europe. We have some uncertainty coming in Latin America, etc. So there seem to be a very large number of people who are, through their vote, or sometimes worse, by not voting, saying, I don't like what I'm getting. I don't like what I see. I'm not satisfied. So what do you suggest we could do with multilateralism to make it more inclusive, to make it more effective to deliver?
Well, thank you. By its very nature, trade is a multilateral activity. We trade with everybody. I think everyone up here on the panel trades with everybody. That isn't the question. The question is, how do you go about reforming the entire system? Our approach has been to start with reforming ourselves. We had an inordinately high tax rate, both on individuals and on corporations. We had this global tax scheme on corporations. We had a whole bunch of things that needed to be fixed. We now have pretty well fixed those to put us in a little better competitive position. Similarly, we feel we were over-regulated in energy and in many other sectors, and so we have now tried to deal with that as well to liberate our very extensive energy resources. Now we're in sort of the next phase, which is trying to deal with our trading partners. And there, the unfortunate situation for us is so much has happened before that we're not starting with a blank sheet of paper. I think if we were all starting with a blank sheet of paper, multilateralism would work far better than starting with where we are. Where we find ourselves in the U.S. is in a situation of asymmetrical tariffs, where we're very much on the low side, including the low side of many of the parties who espouse free trade. We also find standards, regulations that are not science-based, but have the practical net effect of being discriminatory against us. So there are a lot of obstacles that come with the territory. And that's part of the reason we have felt a need to go a little more on our own. Another reason for that is that too often multilateral organizations become an excuse for people to pretend that they're fixing imperfections in the system when all they're really doing is scheduling the next meeting 3 months down the road. We became very dissatisfied with the Global Steel Forum, with all due deference. It's had quite a few meetings, had no real productive result, and that's one of the many factors that led us to take what a lot of you regard as unilateral action on the steel tariffs. But there has been a good side to that, which is many other countries now have put in safeguard measures that I don't believe they would have put in a year ago. They certainly did not put them in then. So while the process may seem clumsy to you, we think it is already beginning to bear some good results. So we are in favor of things that produce very near-term action, not just discussion and not just debates. And we tend to favor bilateral to multilateral in terms of negotiations for a couple of very specific reasons. One, multilaterals take a very, very long time to bear results, and we have a much greater sense of urgency than the idea of a 6 or 8 year negotiation. Second, when there are these very prolonged negotiations, it's our opinion that toward the end, a kind of deal fatigue sets in. Nobody wants to go home and say to his or her spouse, you know what, dear, I just spent 6 years of my life and I came away empty-handed. So it tends to get to compromises that maybe aren't in the best interest. And then the final concern we have with the multilaterals is the very complexity of them. Tends to produce everything down to the lowest common denominator. And since we're usually the largest of the targets, each of the 6 or 8 or 10 or whatever number of negotiating counterparties, each one takes a little nick, and by the time you get through with 6 or 8 or 10, you're pretty well eaten up. So those are the concerns we have about the present form. We do agree that someone needs to be a rule maker, someone needs to be an arbitrator, and we're very relieved to hear the universality of opinion that WTO needs a lot of mending.
Thank you. Dave Parker, New Zealand, small open economy, bridge between East and West, very strategically located, Asia-Pacific region, the most dynamic economic region in the world. How can we accommodate this shifting wealth process that is happening in terms of a multilateralism that actually works?
If it was a bridge to New Zealand, it would be an engineering feat, unlike any other. But you're right, we do sit in an interesting place where we have very strong relationships with our traditional allies in the United States and in Europe, relationships that go back to wars, actually, and patterns of colonization. But we also have a long-standing free trade agreement with China, which has become one of our 2 largest trading partners, and with whom we have a good and fair and in-balance trading relationship. Nonetheless, we think that none of those bilateral relationships that we have are as important as the multilateral system. We think so many problems of the world, whether they're environmental ones relating to unsustainable fishing practices or climate change or fair trade rules, benefit from the international rule of law being improved via multilateralism, which is why we put more effort into multilateralism than into any of our bilateral or plurilateral relationships. Having said that, one of the ways that we are trying to negotiate our way through to this new future is through plurilateral agreements, and we're part of CPTPP. It was interesting that one of the reasons why that is a high quality agreement was because of the power and effort that the United States put into the negotiations, and there are better provisions in that agreement than we've got in any of our other agreements in terms of enforcement mechanisms around labour standards and environmental outcomes. But we suffer some of the same political complexities that other countries face. There has been a rising tide of opposition within New Zealand to trade, despite its our obvious dependency upon it. And our analysis of the core of those problems, at least for ourselves, was that it arises from the insecurity of some of the middle class who find that globalisation is not, in their view, serving their interests. They look around the world and they see so many obvious examples of multinational tax avoidance, so much wealth being accrued to a very small minority in our own country and in other countries around the world. They're having their jobs disrupted through technology, and they sometimes wrongly blame trade for these things rather than other policy. I know, and I think most of us here know, that trade actually isn't responsible for those problems. But my own view is that in order to maintain democratic support for multilateralism and open international relationships that make for prosperity and peace, we actually have to deal with some of the problems at home caused by globalisation. And we've started to do that as a government without doing anything especially radical, and we're, through that process, rebuilding support for both trade and multilateralism.
Thank you very much, Minister Parker. You authored a fantastic piece last week called Advancing New Zealand's Interest in the OECD. Now, in it, you advocated the need for a robust, well-functioning, rules-based multilateral system. So, of course, we heard you on the issue about trade, but are there other areas where you would imagine that perhaps this kind of well-functioning, robust, rules-based multilateral system could benefit the outcomes?
Well, a decade ago, before I suffered a 9-year interregnum in opposition, I was Minister of Energy and Climate Change in the last government led by Helen Clark. It was evident to me then that no one country, either small countries like New Zealand or as large as the United States, can overcome the problems of climate change alone. It's obvious to me that unless the world gets some of these environmental problems under control, we're going to leave a pretty unpleasant planet to our kids, with decreasing biodiversity, migrations caused by rising sea levels, with all of the security implications, and we're also not going to have many fish in the sea. It sometimes feels a bit unfair to me how much trade is asked to do. It was a New Zealand trade official who's now our senior trade negotiator in the world, Vangelis Vitalis, who 20 years ago took the first resolution into the WTO to try and phase out subsidies for illegal fishing. 20 years later, we haven't made any progress, so that perhaps points to the criticisms that are made by Mr. Ross quite fairly of how slowly the international rules evolve. And if we're going to get support multilaterally for multilateral systems, it requires cooperation across all countries. That obvious things like subsidising illegal fishing ought to be phased out. Now, whether that's through trade agreements or multilateral environmental agreements, it still relies upon multilateralism.
Thank you very much. Sib Jensen, Norway has a sovereign wealth fund which is about around $1 trillion, just to make round figures. You are invested in practically every single stock in the world, and that's literal. And therefore, and with some limits and with some management rules, etc., a very admirable, by the way, a very admirable feat that you were truly able to keep for a rainy day. And you just keep adding, so that's a lot of umbrellas that you're building up in there. But the question here is, everything that happens in the world, not only because you're a small, very open economy, depending on trade, but also because the livelihood of your children and grandchildren, given the sovereign wealth fund and its importance, it's depending on what's going on around the world. Therefore, your multilateral antennas must be raised very high. How do you look at this process?
Well, you are absolutely right. We are, the Wealth Fund is currently the owner of 1.4% of global stocks and shares. So of course this is important to us, having access. And the OECD Code of Liberalization of Capital Movements has for decades been a tool to remove barriers to capital movements across borders. And this code has underpinned the Norwegian bet on open capital markets. So continued work to make this code relevant in a changing economic environment is important to all, but it's crucial to us. So I think that, of course, this is one of the reasons why we are so eager to maintain good multilateral systems. But I have to say, when criticism towards multilateral organizations is there, I think we need to take it seriously. We need to listen to each other's concerns, and we need to improve the system. We need to make sure that it continues to be strong and rules-based, but we need to modernize the organizations as well. Because if they're not relevant, we don't need them. We need the organizations to be relevant so that we can keep on strengthening the multilateral trading system and the way we cooperate in many areas, actually.
I'm listening very carefully about this one. So
yeah, I'm sure you do.
Wilbur Ross, you've now been told by the last two speakers that they agree with you in the sense that they can understand the impatience, they can understand that, well, the case of Mr. Parker was not, I don't know if it's typical 20 years, but it seems a little too long. But basically, the question is, there seems to be a willingness to take a hard look at these organizations, the way they work, the way they take decisions, and then the quality of the decisions, because you could accelerate the decision making, but maybe the quality would not follow. So the question is, how do you look at this process? How would you address it, and what would the United States be ready to do in this sense? Because sometimes it looks like we're saying, well, because this doesn't really work too well, we go unilateral, but then you abandon the hope that these multilaterals could be improved.
Well, it's a very complicated question, so I'll give you a complicated answer. We would just as soon operate within frameworks if we were really convinced that people would move quickly, would move decisively. I have yet to see an agenda for any of the multinational organizations that said, here's a list of 10 things we must do right away. That kind of approach, as opposed to interminable study groups, proliferating more study groups, is the kind of thing that gives us very great concern. So we would hope that at some point soon, WTO would have, when other multinational organizations have a meeting really devoted to reformation, because that's what's needed. It did alarm me a little hearing people on the panel say, well, we must respond to the criticism of the public. The public are who we're serving. They're the people that we're accountable to, And it isn't just their criticism. Middle class in many countries in the world has been left behind. It isn't just their impression, it's a fact. And I think unless we really face up to that and acknowledge it, we're not going to get any place. It isn't just that they're criticizing, it's that they are correct to be criticizing is where we think the focus should be.
Mr. Le Maire, President Macron seems to have a clear program for France. He's expressed very clear ideas for the future of Europe. When it comes to the broader international order, you know, what's the French government's vision? What would be the proposals? We're now, at least in the English translation, refonder le multilatéralisme, and we took a few months to translate that into reshaping the foundations of multilateralism. So over to you, because you were the one who brought it home and you were the one who set us to work on this.
I think that the best, Angel, is to wait for the statement of President Macron in a few minutes. He will give.
That's very elegant.
So am I, Angel. But just to give you some advertising about the statement of Emmanuel Macron, we think that we have to, we need to have the multilateralism based on 3 points. The first one is responsibility. Every state should be responsible for that renewal of the multilateral system. Let's take, for instance, one example on which we are working very closely or keen on working very closely with the United States and with other European countries, which is the question of intellectual property. This is a key question for the multilateralism approach and a key question for free trade. We want to work with everybody on that question of intellectual property, how to protect intellectual property, but we need every state around the world to be responsible for that. The second question is inclusiveness. We need to have everybody on board, have all the world states being involved in that process of renewal of the multilateralist approach. And the third pillar of that approach would be efficiency. And on that question, we share the view expressed by Wilbur Ross. We think that we have to move quickly. We cannot wait for 10 more years before having solutions, concrete and specific solutions to improve the multilateralist approach and the multilateralist system. But please, let's wait till 3 o'clock.
Okay.
If Emmanuel Macron is on time, which might be not the case, and you will have a far better answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Didier Reinders, Belgium is a fascinating country. It houses, you agree with that, Jose? It houses a number of communities which in many cases are self-contained, but then they seem to be able to work together, sometimes better than others, but you know, sometimes it takes a little longer to define who's going to be your next government or whatever, but you've always been there anyway, so you know, you're the trait d'union in all these efforts. But the question is there something that Belgium could teach us in terms of how to make it work better, and how we could perhaps get along better and also find common solutions? You seem to have a good way of doing this. Is there something you could share?
We try to do that since just less than 2 centuries. But first of all, to give an example, when we have a free trade agreement at the European level, to give an example with Canada, the CETA, we need to organize the ratification process, of course, in the European Parliament, in 28 different national parliaments, But in Belgium, we need to go to 7 different parliaments with a representation of all the communities in the region. So what are the main elements to try to organize the process? First, we need to have an open and permanent dialogue. Just this morning before to come to Paris, I have had a meeting with all the regions and the communities in Belgium and the federal government. But we need to have a permanent dialogue to try to have good agreements with a benefit for all the different partners. And that's the first element. We need to all the time organize some compromises. We need to organize some good agreements. But then you need a political leadership to implement and to be sure that it's possible to implement the different agreements that we have had on different kind of issues, but certainly on trade, but not only. That's the first element, the permanent dialogue, good agreements, and then a correct implementation of that, a fair implementation of the agreement. But the second element is to be able to organize some reforms at the federal level for the entire country. And it's maybe the same way that we need to manage the discussions inside the multilateral organization, how it's possible to go further with a permanent dialogue and to conclude agreements with all the different partners and to implement that. It's very important to implement the agreements. But then we need also to have the capacity to organize some reforms. And with those two elements, it's possible to go further and to try to live together. And to go back to the same example about the free trade agreement and the CETA, that took just 3 more days before to have an agreement, not only at the European level, in the different member states, but also in Belgium. And so we have just asked Justin Trudeau to wait 3 more days before to come and to sign the agreement with the European Union. So dialogue, and then the capacity to manage reforms inside the country, maybe like inside an international organization.
Thank you. Well, Prime Minister of Latvia, last but not least, you're one of the youngest members, actually the youngest member today legally, although politically we already welcome Lithuania and Colombia. What it is that you believe that Latvia is finding, could find, and how do you think we could serve Latvia better?
I would like to just make a brief remark regarding multilateralism. It is very important to also identify your own interests and be aware of what your cooperation partners want. And OECD enables us to understand exactly what we need and what our interests are. They help us to understand what kind of experts we need, what kind of surveys we need in order to keep ourselves, focused. And we have, been working in this kind of a mode with OECD, and they've helped us in a very targeted manner because we have very clear needs, clearly defined needs, and they help our growth. So I would like to encourage everyone to join OECD because of the expertise that OECD offers.
Thank you very much. Phil O'Reilly of the BIAC and Rich Trumka of the TUAC, they were waiting to make some comments. We're being told that we should cut so that we could go and wait for President Macron, who apparently is going to be just right on time. And I'd like to say to Ministers Nene and Guajardo and Mr. Altmaier and Mr. Šimček, Madame Kag, and then I see here, I see think the 2 ministers, I'm blinded by the, I think that the Latvian ministers who are here, blinded by the lights here, but I'd like to thank you all. Mr. Champagne just arrived. So, Monsieur Larrain, thank you all for joining us today. Thank you for joining the MCM. And we'll be back in a minute with the President of France and the President of Colombia and the President of Lithuania. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, could I please ask you remain in the auditorium? As we've just heard, the opening of the Ministerial Council meeting and the keynote by President Emmanuel Macron of the French Republic will begin shortly. Please be aware that if you leave the hall, it might be tough getting back in given the crowds and the security, but the program will resume in about 10 minutes, hopefully. Thank you.
Of course not.